Hey guys, today I'll show you a science fiction thriller TV series named The OA Season 2. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins in a parallel dimension where a man is skateboarding at night when he suddenly spots a woman in red by the roadside. He hears a whisper and then falls from a great height. The man is abruptly awakened by a rapid knocking on his door. It turns out what had happened earlier was all just a dream. Outside, an elderly Vietnamese woman named Mrs. Vu speaks frantically. When he indicates he doesn't understand, she switches to English, explaining that her granddaughter has gone missing and she needs his help. The young man named Kareem is a private detective living in a houseboat near the Golden Gate Bridge. He enlists a neighbor who had lived in Vietnam to translate. Mrs. Vu from Michigan explains that her granddaughter Michelle had been sending money home after the family lost their house when Michelle's father disappeared. However, 2 weeks ago, the money stopped and the police showed no interest in helping a homeless immigrant, so she didn't report it. Michelle had been sending money in a virtual currency called Ether, worth over $30,000. Despite the potential for a substantial fee, Kareem bluntly tells Mrs. Vu that missing underage girls, especially those gone for more than 72 hours, are often found dead. Seeing Mrs. Vu's determination, he takes the case. Kareem visits the Vietnamese household where Michelle had been staying. They don't know how she made her money, but mention she was always on her phone and not always around. Her last text to Mrs. Vu was about saving money to buy a house. Leaving the house, Kareem is followed by a boy who leads him to a greenhouse. The boy explains that Michelle and other kids played a complex, nameless game there and made money from it. There, Kareem finds Michelle's notes filled with drawings and her phone hidden in a secret compartment. The walls seem mirrored. Just as the boy unlocks Michelle's phone and opens the mysterious game, a dazed young man appears, tackles Kareem and grabs the phone, muttering that his brain holds everything and he has seen millions of himself, all solved by him. He then jumps out the window, landing heavily on the ground. The responding officers know Kareem, but the senior officer clearly dislikes him. They mention the jumper doesn't fit the profile of a drug user. The phone is taken as evidence and the jumper is taken away in an ambulance. Kareem sketches the game's opening symbol and continues his investigation, leading him to the game's hub in Oakland. Inside, he finds models resembling staircases made by players. A seasoned player explains that the game is more of a puzzle. Michelle, being highly skilled, advanced to the later levels, with her last visit being about 2 weeks ago. The seasoned player, stuck on a level herself, tells Kareem that the game has 5 levels, each with cash prizes. Given Michelle's earnings, she must have passed the 4th level, worth over $50,000. The final level offers a $1 million prize. The seasoned player helps Kareem skip to the part where the game interacts with reality. The current puzzle is above the sea, below the stars. After 2 wrong guesses, Kareem finds the answer near the sea level. The next clue, 3 wise men, stumps the seasoned player as well. She's pleased Kareem is hooked on the game and confirms the jumper was also a player who had an emotional breakdown. Kareem asks if Michelle also broke down. The seasoned player says no, she probably completed the game. When Kareem asks what happens after winning, she admits she doesn't know because no one has seen a winner. Kareem decides to track down the game's designer for answers. The scene shifts to a guy talking on the phone with his girlfriend, Nina, who speaks with an accent mixed with Russian. She accuses him of betrayal and demands to know what happened to the people in the house. He pleads with her to meet in person to talk things over and avoid ruining their relationship. Nina agrees to meet, but coldly states there's nothing left to discuss and warns him to stay away from the house. After hanging up, she removes her ring and heads out for the meeting. As she walks, Nina hums the violin tune that Prairie has played since childhood, clutching a keychain with an eyeball charm, deep in thought. Suddenly, she clutches her chest in pain and collapses on the deck, murmuring that she had been shot. In the ambulance, she hears someone calling her Prairie. The scene cuts back to the incident day when OA has been shot and seems to see her captive companion, Homer, smiling before closing her eyes. OA's neighbor and friend, Steve, chases the ambulance outside, shouting for her to take him together, which suggests that she might have successfully entered another world through their collective ritual. Nina wakes up with no accent, asking if they are in San Francisco and claiming her hands don't feel like her own. She passes out again amidst the buzzing in her ears. Upon waking, a nurse checks her awareness, asking if she knows the year. OA responds it's 2016. The nurse asks who the president is, and OA says it's Obama. Confused, the nurse asks who Obama is. However, the news clearly shows President Biden. When she learns her ID says Nina, not Prairie, and sees her meticulously made-up face with no injuries, OA realizes she had made it and jumped to another world. OA has now inhabited Nina's body in a parallel world. Unsure of the origin of the injuries on her arm, she is deemed mentally unstable and given a sedative. Kareem, investigating the mysterious game, gets a tip that tasks with such high rewards are usually the work of the Silicon Valley mogul, Pierre, who is also a major investor in Ether. OA, hearing that her boyfriend at Nina's time has arrived, refuses to see him when she realizes he's not Homer. Pierre's name means nothing to her. The medical staff informs her that they couldn't find any information on a matching Homer except for a psychiatrist with that name. They did manage to contact her foster mother, who doesn't recognize OA but agrees to speak after hearing about an amnesiac patient looking for family. It turns out that in this world, the foster mother never met the blind girl at her aunt's and never adopted Nina. OA thanks her and apologizes for her past indifference. OA learns she will be held for observation for 14 days, but can choose between staying there or at a private clinic on Treasure Island, which rarely has vacancies. Thanks to someone's arrangement, she opts for the clinic, which has internet access and a quiet environment for thinking. The medical staff takes her to Nina's penthouse to pack. The doorman, seeing her struggle with the door, calls her Nina and offers to help her. The luxurious interior surprises OA, who recognizes her first day of school photo. Other photos don't match her memories. Seeing a picture of adult Nina with her biological father, Roman, she wants to contact him but learns that Roman was recently murdered. From the memorial for a childhood friend who died in a school bus accident, OA pieces together that Nina wasn't on the school bus that day and never went blind. She also discovers a cabinet with a high-tech lock. As they near the clinic, OA feels unwell. The medical staff reassures her, saying the clinic is far better than a public hospital. She then escorts OA inside. Turning to the investigator Kareem, he follows Pierre to a location marked with the name Curie, which stands for Collective Unconscious Research Institute, and features a design reminiscent of Michelle's handwriting. He stops a cleaning company truck and bribes his way inside, where he discovers they are monitoring something. However, they don't allow him to stay long. He spots a girl being led away by lab personnel and decides to follow, but a password-locked door blocks his way. Kareem then crawls through the ventilation ducts, arriving above a room filled with people either sleeping or recording their dreams. In the ward, OA reflects on the differences between her experiences and those of the parallel world Nina, using the school bus incident as a dividing point. She suddenly hears footsteps approaching and sees someone coming towards her. She realizes he's her companion Homer during their experiments and calls his name. But Homer, a doctor working here in this world, doesn't recognize her, assuming his ID exposed his name. OA asks if he remembers her, but Dr. Homer responds he knows she's Nina. OA insists she's OA, but Dr. Homer replies that it's fine if she wants him to call her OA. He then tells her he will take her to meet the director, who is a legend in this field and may help her with her illness. As they walk, OA notices Rachel, Renata, and Scott all confined in the ward. Before she can react, Dr. Homer leads her into a room, introducing her to the director. As soon as he speaks, OA lunges at him in anger, recognizing him as Dr. Hap. The next morning, Dr. Homer wakes up listening to a modern psychiatry radio show discussing shared psychotic disorder, where close relationships with patients can induce or exacerbate mental disturbances. In his office, Hap apologizes to OA for the straitjacket. OA demands to know what's going on with Homer. Hap dismisses the question, saying they've both transferred into their counterparts in another dimension. He explains that his parallel self in this world hasn't worked in emergency rooms and hasn't researched near-death experiences. However, he's a renowned psychologist and psychiatrist. OA notes that Nina's life diverged from hers at a certain point, likening it to a garden of forking paths where different choices led to different selves. Hap admits he doesn't know why Homer's soul or consciousness didn't transfer into Dr. Homer. OA then asks about the details of their crossing. Hap recounts how they gathered everyone after leaving her on the roadside and injected a drug that would stop their hearts unless they performed a strange ritual. Homer initially resisted but eventually complied, leading them to awaken in the parallel world amidst the sound of carbon monoxide alarms. Scott attacked Hap, but Homer intervened, protecting Hap and surprisingly calling him the director. This confirms that Homer's soul or consciousness didn't transfer into Dr. Homer. Hap, realizing his identity from his ID, learns that Dr. Homer is his protege. Concluding that Homer must have died in the original world, OA shakes her head, refusing to believe their journey was in vain. Hap insists it wasn't, suggesting they have a unique bond and should continue their research together. He muses about the infinite possibilities of time and space, questioning how to control their crossings. OA is uninterested in his scientific zeal, retorting that he's just a warden, indifferent to his location. Frustrated by her non-cooperation, Hap injures himself and frames OA, resulting in her being placed in isolation, cut off from other patients. OA shouts for Homer, resisting fiercely. Dr. Homer arrives, calming her with a mild sedative. OA insists that he had just forgotten and he would remember. On the other side, investigator Kareem learns from lab participants that they are awakened after each REM sleep cycle to record their dreams. Though they don't know the experiment's purpose and haven't seen the mysterious game, they mention that a British experiment supervisor left abruptly 2 weeks ago, much to Pierre's fury. Kareem then asks his investigation partner to track down the experiment supervisor. Meanwhile, the police confirm that the boy who jumped from the window of the greenhouse didn't enter from outside. Pierre calls, asking when Nina will be discharged. Hap claims she's had a mental breakdown and needs to stay hospitalized. Nina had discovered their activities in a certain house, accusing Pierre of betrayal, but it's unclear how much she knew. Before hanging up, Pierre mentions sending a new test subject. Dr. Homer blamed himself for injecting Nina with a sedative and opposed isolating her. He felt like a prison guard rather than a doctor lately. Hap convinced him that it was all for the patient's sake and assigned him to handle OA's treatment to figure out how she believed she had crossed into this parallel world. Dr. Homer noted that there had never been a case of shared delusions among strangers before, suggesting that Scott and the others had already been classified. The partner, heavily pregnant, meets Kareem later and reveals that the experiment supervisor, before joining the Collective Unconscious Research Institute, worked for MI5 and disappeared suddenly 14 days ago, leaving almost no trace. However, the partner's exceptional skills lead her to discover that the experiment supervisor frequently visited a bookstore. Before leaving, the partner asks Kareem if he wants to feel the baby. Kareem silently withdraws his hand. The next day, Dr. Homer began treating OA. He asked her, since she also claimed to have crossed over, why she didn't arrive by performing a strange ritual like Scott and Renata. OA replied that she was not the only one, mentioning Rachel. It turns out that Rachel in the parallel world had suffered brain damage from a car accident, rendering her unable to communicate through writing or singing. OA tried to awaken Homer by jumping in place, but learned that although he also played college football, he had never been seriously injured in a game. Dr. Homer asked if they really crossed over and inhabited these bodies, where the original consciousnesses went and where Nina was. OA retorted she didn't care about that and she just wanted him to remember her. At that moment, a noise came from the ceiling. OA realized it matched Homer's description of his near-death experience. Dr. Homer reached up, but felt nothing. OA reminded him he had ever said he saw a hand, but he didn't know it was his own. Dr. Homer didn't believe her smelly bullshit and refused OA's request to see Scott and the others. Suddenly, an alarm went off. A nurse reported that a patient in a pink jacket was running wild. OA was now even more convinced that this was Homer's near-death realm. Dr. Homer, having no time for idle conversation, went to check the situation, while Hap monitored everything remotely. Meanwhile, investigator Kareem ordered a book as a gift for the experiment supervisor and tracked the delivery person to find her. He explained that he was investigating Michelle's whereabouts and mentioned his past as an FBI agent, during which he had crossed moral lines that he couldn't rectify. He hoped that if the experiment supervisor knew anything, he wouldn't miss the chance to make amends. She didn't respond directly, but recounted how, as early as the 1920s, German psychologists discovered that some patients dreamt of men in black, the Berlin bloodshed, and paired snakes, foretelling the rise of the Nazis. Pierre had hired her to predict future events through collective dreaming. She left because she believed Pierre crossed a red line, bringing things from dreams into reality. She added that although she knew someone would find her eventually, she was glad it was Kareem. However, she insisted they ensure there were no listening devices before continuing. In her isolation cell, a distraught OA cried, reminiscing about Homer, who had calmed her when she was first confined, and thinking of her friends who listened to her stories. She soon sketched their likenesses on paper, surprised at her own skill. Hearing her cries, Dr. Homer privately allowed her to go to the activity room. OA noticed a fish tank similar to the one in the basement and saw Renata, who dismissed OA's tales of the original world as fantasies and told her to leave. However, Scott and Rachel came over, and the three embraced. Renata's disbelief was a result of Dr. Homer's treatment. Scott remarked that this prison was even more terrifying than Hap's lab. OA asked them not to worry and promised she would get them all out of here. Scott asked how she arrived here. OA showed her the sketches, explaining that they sent her here. When Rachel saw the drawings, she reached out and touched the face of Steve. Scott then echoed Hap's curiosity. How did OA manage to arrive in this specific world out of many? OA replied she just knew that she was focused on Homer at the time. They need to find a way to awaken him quickly. She had tried, but the more she tried, the more Dr. Homer thought she was crazy. OA mentioned that this was the time and place of Homer's near-death realm, recalling that he swallowed a sea anemone in this very fish tank. She also guessed that Dr. Homer was watching them from behind the mirror. They decided not to prove the story's truth, but to expose Hap's true nature. Scott suggested that Rachel, who helped in Hap's lab, might have seen something secretive. Though Rachel couldn't verbalize, OA encouraged her to communicate in other ways. Rachel started pulling out items for them to guess, and soon they identified keywords like house, teenagers, and map. OA realized Hap was mapping multi-dimensional spaces. Dr. Homer, thrilled that Rachel found a way to communicate, watched as she picked up a flower for them to guess. However, Hap noticed their interaction and rushed to stop it. OA shouted at Dr. Homer, saying if they were just patients, why Hap was so scared. On the other side, once assured Kareem wasn't bugged, the experiment supervisor continued, explaining that Pierre had always used dreams to predict the market, staying a step ahead in investments. Most dreams were straightforward to interpret until last year, when the women involved in the experiment started having highly similar dreams. These dreams featured 3 distinct images: a coffin-sized tunnel, a spiraling double staircase, and a stained glass window with a rose design. All 3 of these elements were present in the greenhouse that Kareem had visited. However, they couldn't yet decipher the greenhouse's true significance. The mysterious game was merely a ploy to lure people there to help Pierre uncover the truth. Kareem mentioned he had been to the greenhouse but found nothing special. The experiment supervisor suggested that meant he hadn't truly entered the house. Back at home, Kareem examined the design plans for the greenhouse, noting the staircase and the rose window, but failing to locate the tunnel. His partner also discovered that the greenhouse was not owned by Pierre or the Collective Unconscious Research Institute, but by a Russian trust fund. The fund's beneficiary was someone named Nina, who had recently been admitted to a private clinic on Treasure Island due to violent psychiatric issues. Meanwhile, Hap's new experimental subject turned out to be the window jumper from before, who was now muttering he could see and hear 47 versions of himself. The camera shifts to the jumper, now submerged on the lab table. The object in his ear has started to sprout. Hap mentions that everyone has a seed in their brain, and somehow the greenhouse awakens that seed. At this moment, Rachel glances at the code-locked door. After a while, the lab table is empty, and Hap emerges from the code-locked door, which hasn't been locked yet. Seizing the opportunity, Rachel sneaks in while Hap is distracted. Inside, she sees something astonishing, and in her rage, she stabs Hap. Unfortunately, he pushes her down, causing her to bleed profusely. Her perspective shifts to the near-death realm, where she follows faint glimmers of light and arrives at a house with its door wide open, stopping in front of a mirror. From downstairs, a woman's voice calls out, saying Michelle left the door open again. However, a boy on the bed responds, asking her not to call him Michelle, and his name is Buck. As it was revealed in the last season, Buck's birth name was Michelle before he changed his gender. In the original world, Prairie lies quietly in a coffin, surrounded by flowers. The scene shifts to Steve, who is speeding in a car with Jesse. They get pulled over for speeding. The officer asks if they have been drinking, and Steve denies it and replies they just came from a funeral. The officer recognizes the name on the ID and says he's sorry for their friend's death. He then urged them to drive safely on the way back before leaving. Meanwhile, Buck's mother is urging him to pack his things. Their family plans to move away to keep him away from all the chaos, and they didn't allow Buck to attend the funeral. After his mother leaves, Buck hears a buzzing sound, seemingly coming from the mirror. While pondering this, he receives a message from Steve about having a plan and asking him to bring Alfonso. They gather at the hot-tempered girl's house, where Steve declares he's figured out they are just in a bad timeline and should follow OA to another world for a fresh start. However, Alfonso, still skeptical due to the books under his bed, believes the gunman was merely distracted by them. Buck questions why OA appeared at that moment, to which Alfonso responds that OA might be mentally unstable and could have been stalking them. Steve accuses Alfonso of being too comfortable in this timeline to try something new, predicting that even if he goes to college, his life will still be a mess. The meeting ends in disagreement. On the other side, the homeroom teacher, Betty, is dreaming. In her dream, she looks at a photo of herself and her missing twin brother. A figure at the door says he needs help. She wakes up just as she calls out her brother's name, finding herself with a nosebleed and faint whispers in her ears. Buck hears the buzzing sound again and gets up to investigate. He feels something pass behind him and sees a woman's figure in the mirror, singing. He rushes to find Steve to explain, suspecting it might be Rachel based on the song. Steve questions why she would come to him, and Buck speculates it might be because he keeps the door open. When they check the mirror again, nothing is there. Steve theorizes that Rachel might only appear at nightfall and that OA might be in trouble. Buck confirms that Rachel seemed distressed. Steve can't wait to go mock Alfonso. Meanwhile, Alfonso meets with OA's foster father to apologize for his previous determination to prove OA right, only to find books that made her seem like a liar. The old man explains that the books were bought by the FBI counselor to make him and his wife more receptive to OA's stories, which began long before the books were introduced. Thus, the old man confirmed the stories couldn't have been fabricated based on the books. Buck gathers everyone at his house, but the vanity mirror has already been donated by his mother. Alfonso dismisses Buck's experience as imagination and mentions that he also thought he saw Homer when he picked up the books. Buck insists that even if Homer was Alfonso's hallucination, he genuinely saw Rachel. With Buck's mother's permission, Alfonso takes Buck to find the mirror, promising to return soon. They learn that the mirror has been sent elsewhere, a 2-hour drive away. Frustrated, Jesse asks what Rachel was singing. Buck hums a few notes, realizing they spell out BBA, the initials of their homeroom teacher, Betty. They decide to visit their teacher. Betty is surprised, but doesn't know how she can help. She has already booked a trip to say goodbye to her terminally ill uncle. Steve noticed that the place where they needed to find the mirror was on the way to the uncle's house. He convinced Betty to help them find the mirror first, and then visit her uncle afterward. The group found the mirror and decided to wait until sunset for Rachel to appear. Betty advised them to inform their parents that they wouldn't be coming home soon to avoid causing any unnecessary worry. When the hot-tempered girl mentioned the shooting incident, everyone marveled at how they had all emerged unscathed. It was truly miraculous. Even Alfonso agreed this time, noting that it seemed like OA had somehow drawn the bullets towards herself. The store clerks, who had read about the incident, recognized them as the heroes from the shooting. Although they couldn't let them wait in the store, they offered a place for them to stay, a church where the clerk's father was the pastor. She recalled how her father always opened the church to those in need. That night, they waited by the mirror, but nothing happened. Frustrated, Alfonso got up and left, arranging to meet a local guy for some relaxation. Feeling uneasy, Jesse snuck off to buy some painkillers and asked the seller if they were safe to take. The seller assured him that taking one would be fine. Meanwhile, Alfonso was conversing with the local guy about a woman who had disappeared and then returned, refusing to tell the police about her experience but sharing it with them. He couldn't determine if she was an angel, a fraud, or just insane. Now, they were waiting by the mirror for someone to appear. The local guy, who had a respect for the supernatural, mentioned that he had an aunt who was a medium and could communicate with the deceased. Maybe she could help them. When Alfonso returned to the church, everyone else was asleep. He heard a buzzing sound coming from the mirror but couldn't hear it when he moved closer, so he turned around and went to sleep. In the morning, Alfonso suggested they visit the medium to try every possible method to help Buck accept the situation. Seeing his change in attitude, Steve teased him. They joked around but then realized the medium was 500 miles away. Alfonso asked Steve if he had called his mom. Steve said he hadn't, and in truth, neither had Alfonso. The group set off again. On the way, Buck hung up a call from his mother. Jesse sighed, saying that having a mom is really nice. Suddenly, they hit something on the road, causing the mirror to fly out and shatter. Only Jesse stayed behind to put an end to the suffering of the injured animal. They didn't know that Buck's mother had already reported them missing to the police, fearing they had joined a cult. When they met the medium, she asked what they wanted. They explained they wanted to communicate with Rachel, but the medium was confused by their talk of another dimension. Seeing the broken mirror made her very nervous, fearing that trapped spirits might haunt her. She insisted on sending them away unless they paid extra. They agreed, and the seance began. Soon, Buck heard the buzzing sound again. Following the sound, he entered the next room where the TV started displaying chaotic images. They interpreted the images as a blind girl emerging from a bunker and being able to see, suggesting OA had crossed into another dimension. The second message implied that only Betty could ensure safety. Then, a stained glass window with a rose pattern appeared. Betty, as if drawn by an unseen force, approached it, her nose running and bleeding. She seemed to hear something only she could. Just as she touched the window, the screen shattered. The scene shifts to Nina's dream, where the young Nina leads OA to a floating crystal coffin. Nina says she won't find Homer without it. After hearing Rachel's song, OA sees her lying inside the coffin. She then hears faint whispers, and the figure inside the coffin turns into herself, banging on the glass trying to get out. The scene shifts. OA has just finished telling Dr. Homer about the dream. Dr. Homer asks if that is her younger self or Nina. OA replies they were the same person as children, and due to the school bus incident, they lived two different lives. Dr. Homer then asks if she thinks Hap is a hunter who imprisoned her, and if she had also imprisoned Nina by burying her deep inside due to trauma. That's why she dreams of her trying to get out. OA impatiently asks if Dr. Homer has tracked down Rachel's whereabouts. Dr. Homer says she was transferred to another facility. OA believes Rachel is in trouble, maybe even killed by Hap to keep his near-death experiments from being exposed. But Dr. Homer insists he had been to his lab and there's nothing special there. OA counters, saying there must be a locked room or something he couldn't access. Dr. Homer pauses before explaining that it's not uncommon for patients to see their doctors as their tormentors. It's understandable she feels that way. Meanwhile, Hap is looking at Rachel in his trunk, muttering that it's all Prairie's fault before proceeding to handle the body. At the clinic, investigator Kareem visits, threatening to call the police if he can't see Nina. The nurse reluctantly informs OA, who initially doesn't want to go, thinking it's someone Nina knows. But when she hears it's about a certain house, she changes her mind. Kareem thinks OA looks familiar and asks if they had met before. OA replies she doesn't know because she is told she has amnesia, though she is not the one who's lost her memory. Kareem explains that while investigating missing girls, he found out Nina owns the greenhouse and works at the Collective Unconsciousness Research Institute, which led him here. He asks if she knows about the secret entrance to the greenhouse. OA realizes this is related to the house and the teenagers Rachel mentioned. She admits she has lost many years of her memory, but insists she was deliberately confined here. She promises to lead Kareem to the secret entrance if he gets her out. Kareem warns if they see any signs of mental illness, he will bring her back. OA retorts to him that she is not sick. She then smashes a vase to distract the nurse, and they make a break for it. They're soon discovered, and Kareem tells OA to get to the orange car while he holds off the staff. Though OA has never driven before, she manages to get the car moving, erratically picking up Kareem and speeding away from the clinic. Dr. Homer can only watch as they disappear into the distance. Kareem introduces the greenhouse, built in the 1910s by an engineer who struck it rich during the gold rush for his medium wife. The house had been renovated before being restored to its original state. The blueprints are not the original ones, so the location of the secret entrance is unknown. Seeing that OA can't figure it out, Kareem shows her a riddle of the three wise men, but she is equally puzzled. He then suggests looking at some photos he took to see if they jog her memory. As she flips through the photos, she suddenly blurts out Buck's name when she sees a picture of Michelle. Kareem asks if she knows this missing girl. OA hesitates and replies that the girl just reminded her of a boy she knew back in Michigan. OA then asks Kareem how much he knows about the director of the Collective Unconsciousness Research Institute. Kareem explains that Dr. Hap wrote a book called Quantum Psychiatry and was also her boyfriend Pierre's psychiatrist. OA realizes that her being sent to the clinic was no coincidence. These people and events are interconnected. Seeing the institute combination lock, she remembers that Nina had a similar one and decides to go to the apartment to look for clues. Meanwhile, Hap is soaking in a pool, hearing a faint buzzing sound. A mysterious woman named Elodie joins him, mirroring his position. She claims to be in the pool to relieve her tinnitus and says she can hear Hap's buzzing too. She invites him to listen to hers, suggesting that they both have the sound because they don't belong here. She reveals that she recently traveled into this body and guesses that Hap is also a traveler. She suggests they go somewhere else to talk. Just as Hap is about to leave with the mysterious woman, he receives news that Nina has escaped, causing him to panic. He worries that Rachel's situation might be exposed and orders Dr. Homer to emphasize to the police that she is a violent psychiatric patient who must be returned to the clinic, then hurriedly hangs up and leaves with Elodie, who can travel from one dimension to the other. At the clinic, Dr. Homer is distracted while listening to Scott talk about another dimension, mentioning OA. Dr. Homer asks if he means Nina. Scott replies she is OA in the original world while Nina is in this world. Renata notices Dr. Homer's distraction and connects it to OA, commenting that OA is very adept at influencing people. Dr. Homer retorts that OA has gone now and she can't affect them anymore. Scott laughs, saying she wouldn't just run away. OA definitely has a plan and she won't give up on Homer and will come back. Meanwhile, OA and Kareem arrive at the apartment but can't figure out the password. OA asks Kareem to talk to distract her. Kareem shares a story about a friend who was happily single until he fell in love. They agreed not to have children, lived happily for 7 years, but one day his partner suddenly wanted kids. When OA asks for the password, Kareem suggests one, which works. Inside the safe, they find it filled with cassette tapes. They play one and hear Nina's voice, but the content is surprisingly risque, so they quickly switch tapes. Kareem realizes these tapes record dreams like the Collective Unconsciousness Research Institute. They also find a note with Syzygy written on it, matching the riddle's clue. They call the number labeled Syzygy on Nina's phone. The person on the other end notices something off about OA's voice, but she feigns illness to cover it up. When asked when she'll arrive, OA says, "Tonight." The person responds he got it and they will have it ready. OA asks for the address, and the person replies that her driver knows, asking her to remember to dress appropriately, and she can start as soon as she arrives. During dinner, as soon as Hap sits down, he asks Elodie how she knew he was a time traveler. Elodie replies if he travels a lot, he will just know. Hap then asks if she knows how to control the destination. Elodie responds, traveling isn't about control. You can influence, integrate, and understand, like an actor experiencing different roles. You can see different lives through your work. Travelers can also see or experience their own different lives. Hearing this, Hap suddenly realizes something. However, when Elodie hears about finding 4 people to perform a strange ritual, she bursts out laughing, saying she didn't expect someone like him to use that method. Hap is confused, but Elodie explains it's like trains and planes can both take him far. The key is having fuel to provide power. At the clinic, Dr. Homer follows instructions, emphasizing to the police that the escaped patient is violent and must be brought back. Meanwhile, he matches with a girl on a dating app, hoping to relax. During dinner, he mentions a patient who insists they're soulmates from another world. But when he talks about Homer crossing into this dimension and swallowing the marine life from the fish tank, he chokes on his seafood. However, when it comes time to pay the bill, fearing the girl might help split the cost and cover the few extra dollars he spent, he insists on paying separately, causing her to lose interest and leave. On his way home, he gets a call from Hap, asking if he has found OA. Hap offers him a chance to redeem himself, saying he has made a breakthrough and needs details from Scott about his so-called near-death realm. Dr. Homer agrees, promising not to disappoint Hap. Meanwhile, OA practices Nina's accent using recordings to avoid revealing her identity. She also notices cigarettes nearby. After changing clothes, Kareem realizes that the woman in red from his dream is OA. When OA asks what happened next in the dream, Kareem admits he doesn't remember because he woke up after falling from a height. The doorman sees them leaving and asks if they need a driver. OA tells him to have the driver wait at the back door. On the way, OA asks Kareem if it's him rather than his friend who didn't want kids. They arrive at Syzygy, which appears to be a high-end men's boutique, but is actually a secret club. The manager, who seems familiar with Nina, says she hasn't returned his calls for days. If her father were alive, he'd be furious. OA, still recovering, uses her condition as an excuse. Kareem mentions that the greenhouse is very close and suggests they investigate it first. The bartender notices OA disliking her drink and offers to get her another. OA declines, fearing she might get drunk, which the bartender takes as a joke, implying Nina has a high tolerance for alcohol. The singing of 5 children wearing sunglasses triggers OA's memory of the moment before she entered Nina's body. Just then, the manager comes over to take her away. OA cautiously admits she doesn't remember what to do. The manager laughs, saying she always says that, but she always knows what to do. He then expresses his puzzle as to her American accent because she should be a Russian. Shortly after, OA finds herself tied to a chair. Kareem found his way to the projection room. The projectionist began a countdown and pulled back the curtain, revealing an audience below. Behind OA, there was a giant octopus. The octopus wrapped a GPS tentacle around her arm and began to speak, though no one else could hear it. The octopus knew she wasn't Nina and introduced itself, saying Nina calls it Old Night. It instructed OA to relay its words to the audience. Its brothers and sisters of the ocean have always looked down on humans, but it still holds hope for her. Nina has always acted as a medium, helping it communicate with her, but tonight it has the honor of meeting OA herself. OA was stunned. Old Night offered to help her, but demanded she first reveal her true nature as an angel. Reluctantly, OA told the audience she was a traveler through time and space. Puzzled, Kareem noticed a door on the surveillance feed. Old Night warned that lies would age OA quickly and that her time was running out, as it does in every dimension. It reminded OA to keep translating so the audience would think it was part of the performance and not interfere. OA continued, telling the audience that her future self will forget her true self. Old Night will send her there to that moment where she can show her true self, her pure existence, and awaken her mission. For this, Old Night will kill her, and she will be dead for exactly 37 seconds. Old Night then said it needed OA's permission to proceed. Unsure if she would survive, OA hesitated. Old Night explained that it depended on her brother. OA was confused, having no brother. Old Night clarified that in every dimension, he is sent to protect her. Kareem, watching from the surveillance room, saw the scene on the stage. OA told the audience she now permitted Old Night to kill her. Then, the octopus tightened its grip around her neck with a snap, causing the crowd to stir. Sensing something was wrong, Kareem rushed down to find OA. Old Night began a countdown. In a near-death state, OA found herself in an airplane bathroom. She walked to the front where a short-haired woman turned, but OA couldn't see her face clearly. Before the countdown ended, she was pulled out of the near-death realm. Kareem struggled, but finally managed to revive OA, finding a severed tentacle on the floor. Meanwhile, Elodie was listening to an opera and asked Hap what makes these sounds music and not noise. Hap guessed if it was willpower. He realized that OA's arrival hinged on her will toward Homer, who must also be here. At that moment, Dr. Homer was trying to extract information from Scott. Scott remarked, "He is like those moths that used to navigate by starlight, but are now confused by artificial light." Dr. Homer didn't respond, silently turning on a recorder and asking about the near-death realm. At the club, Kareem and OA evaded the police and arrived at a familiar door from the game. Kareem asked OA if she was sure she wanted to go in. OA admitted it. Kareem thought OA was braver than she seemed, and OA thought Kareem was kinder than he appeared. Hand in hand, they entered the door together. At an unknown time and place, a wandering Homer arrives at an old woman's place, carrying a bundle of branches to trade for what she calls a shell. The old woman appears obsessed with the wood, and there are many human figures embedded in wooden frames around her. She tells Homer not to touch the limited editions and to search deeper inside. Homer is looking for a girl. The old woman asks if he is searching for a lost lover and suggests he reach out and feel. Homer admits he might not recognize her because he has only touched her once. Clearly, this is OA's Homer. As he tries to identify her, a flash of their single touch crosses his mind, and Dr. Homer wakes up, staring at Nina's photo, deep in thought. Kareem and OA navigate a long underground tunnel. Kareem asks what OA meant by what she said on stage. OA replies that it was just a name. As the tunnel narrows, Kareem realizes it's the size of a coffin. They reach a junction blocked by an iron gate with a wooden cover above them. Suddenly, water starts flooding in, quickly rising above their heads. OA's childhood memory of being trapped underwater resurfaces. They follow the rising water, open the wooden cover above, and climb out from a well into the basement of the greenhouse. It's pitch dark except for a faint light high above, resembling an exit. OA feels a narrow staircase along the wall. Kareem deduces that Michelle must have used this secret entrance, which is why she couldn't be found. They emerge from a fireplace, fashioning a torch from paint, and continue exploring. A chandelier suddenly lights up next door. They are in the twin spiral staircases with portraits of the engineer and his psychic wife on the walls. Kareem remembers that beyond the chandelier is the main door of the greenhouse and suggests OA wait outside. OA refuses, insisting they both head to the attic with the rose window to find Michelle. However, as they ascend the stairs, they find only a hallway with no doors. Advancing further, they come down the other side. OA notices the floor tiles are magnetic, and their patterns resemble a puzzle. She senses something moving nearby. Meanwhile, Elodie and Hap are having a conversation after their 2-minute hormone yoga session. Elodie senses that Hap is thinking about some girl he loves. Hap dismisses it, saying it's just a partnership, but admits the girl always takes him to unexpected places, and he can be himself only with her. Suddenly, Elodie decides to head home, promising to meet again tomorrow. Hap pleads with her to stay, saying he has many questions that need answers. Sensing danger, Elodie discreetly calls the police. While Hap prepares a syringe to sedate her, Elodie remains calm, suggesting they relax a bit more first. In the clinic, Dr. Homer enters Rachel's room and finds all her belongings still there. He tricks a nurse into giving him the key to the director's office, where he finds Rachel's transfer records. Contacting the receiving hospital, he learns they have no admission record for Rachel and asks them to double-check. While waiting for a response, he discovers a hidden compartment in the desk containing a book on quantum psychiatry and a box of tapes labeled with Pierre's name. The tape is titled "Thoughts About the House." He plays the tape, which starts with Dr. Hap's voice, speaking to an unknown person about the house. It turns out, the original building was damaged by an earthquake and then destroyed by fire. The engineer bought the land at a low price. His wife, a psychic, sensed something unusual about the site. During the groundbreaking, they discovered a natural spring, a sacred site for a local tribe. It's said that this spring could grant shamans the eyes of the gods. The psychic believed the house should not be built there, but the engineer insisted they had a duty to protect the spring. Therefore, they designed the greenhouse as a puzzle. Those who are worthy could gain enlightenment through the rose window, while the unworthy would be trapped inside until their destruction. In the greenhouse, Kareem and OA finish assembling the floor tiles and hear the sound of a mechanism unlocking. They go to investigate but enter different passages despite starting side by side. They can hear each other but cannot see one another. From outside, light is visible through the rose window. Kareem hears what sounds like teenage laughter and goes to check if it's Michelle. Upon entering, the door disappears, trapping him in the room. OA can no longer hear his voice. Kareem discovers the room has sealed windows, and to conserve oxygen, he extinguishes his torch. His phone is water-damaged and unusable, leading him to panic and collapse on the bed. Meanwhile, OA finds herself in front of a door after navigating a hallway. At this moment, Dr. Homer is listening to the tape, which reveals that the puzzle was designed based on the psychic's dreams. After the greenhouse was built, the engineer wanted to solve the puzzle himself. The psychic disagreed, believing their duty was to guard the place, but the engineer couldn't resist the temptation. At that moment, Dr. Homer receives a message from the other hospital confirming that Rachel was indeed never admitted. OA enters a room that creaks and has faint knocking sounds. She asks if it's Buck, but there's no response. Following the noise, she inspects the wall and discovers it's just a layer of paper with a glass window behind it. The sound was simply branches tapping against the window in the wind. Kareem dreams of falling from a great height and wakes up with a start. Calmer now, he searches around and finds a hidden passage under the bed. Dr. Homer continues listening to the recording. It's revealed that the psychic was a member of a women's association composed of the wives of notable mining engineers from San Francisco. They met monthly to protect indoor trees and natural spaces, which led to the preservation of Golden Gate Park. However, one day after returning from a meeting, she found the engineer collapsed in the attic with the rose window open. Since she hadn't used the puzzle to reach the attic, she only saw the normal view outside the window. She speculated that her husband had solved the puzzle and was lost in what he saw on the other side. The psychic believed that someone capable of withstanding the sight beyond the window would come and perhaps help rescue her husband, but he passed away after years in a coma. Back to the present, Kareem navigates the hidden passage, entering a room with a model of the greenhouse. The model is detailed, even including the trees in the yard. Unbeknownst to him, OA is in the room with the light in the model, facing the very tree. She opens the window and hears whispers calling OA and Nina to come. The tree branches seem to reach out to her. Following the voice, she climbs the tree but falls into its center, only to be caught by the roots. She hears a whisper saying he has arrived, followed by a cacophony of whispers. The noise grows louder until she covers her waxy ears, and then it feels like something connects. Silence falls, leaving only one voice, presumably the tree speaking that they thought they'd never see her again, and over the years they've been calling her from deep underground. Realizing she hasn't heard this before, OA communicates telepathically, just as she did on stage. The voice continues, asking if she didn't feel the wind calling her. Suddenly, OA understands. Nina was a medium capable of communicating with nature. The voice continues, saying Old Knight had so much to tell her but ran out of time since the situation is dire. And now, the one who wants to possess her is about to make a significant discovery. He aims to destroy her faith and make her dependent on him. She can only restore and prevail by forming a community. OA insists she can fight alone, but Old Knight counters, saying that fighting alone is like a tree trying to survive on its own. When one tree is sick, they all provide nutrients. As OA wonders what to do next, Old Knight reassures her they are already gathering around her, reminding her that Nina is the key. Inside the greenhouse, Karim opens the rose window on the model, and water starts to gush out. He hears a noise from behind a door and goes to investigate. Behind the door, there's a vast, empty expanse of soil. He calls out Michelle's name and suddenly feels something approaching. It seems like many people are emerging from the ground, all trying to grab him. He quickly escapes through a door ahead, entering a room surrounded by mirrors. Turning around, he sees another person in the room. It's the aged and frail seasoned player. She weakly asks what took him so long. Karim recalls the mirrored surface behind the wall when he was searching for Michelle and realizes this room might be behind it. The seasoned player instructs him to go through a side door, but he doesn't listen, focused on rescuing her. He breaks the mirror and carries her to the roadside. A car passes by, splashing water on them. When he looks again, the seasoned player has returned to her normal state, with something emerging and retracting from her ear. Meanwhile, during their hormone yoga session, Elodie tells Hap to remember this feeling. It's fuel. She then suddenly stands up, placing 5 cubes on the floor. One by one, they stand up and open, revealing some kind of miniature devices. Hap is puzzled and follows Elodie's gaze as the devices start performing a strange ritual in unison. Suddenly, there's a whooshing sound, and Elodie collapses. The devices begin to close, and in a panic, Hap manages to grab one. At the same time, he hears the sound of an ambulance siren approaching. The scene shifts to the original world where the group's car breaks down on the way to Betty's uncle's house. Steve blames Betty for not jumping through dimensions with rituals and insists on seeing her uncle first. Jesse firmly states that Betty needs to say goodbye to her family. Just then, a kind driver passes by and offers them a lift, bringing smiles back to their faces. Dropped off at a rest area, Steve complains to the hot-tempered girl that Betty doesn't really want to go, and he would like to cross into that dimension right away. The hot-tempered girl empathizes with Steve's frustration about not being able to find OA, but reminds him that Rachel specifically said only Betty should go. Betty, having just contacted the repair shop, decides to wait until the car is fixed before continuing the journey. Jesse mentions that since Buck found those books, he's been verifying OA's story. He hasn't found precise information about the mine or the school for the blind, but based on Homer's description of the afterlife environment, he located a matching clinic in the San Francisco Bay Area. He suggests they check it out, thinking Rachel might have been there too. This could help Betty feel more at ease. The group, however, thinks it's unnecessary, believing OA is in another dimension. At that moment, they notice an Amber Alert on TV showing Buck's photo, with Betty listed as the suspect. It turns out that Buck's mother had long suspected Betty of brainwashing the kids. Realizing none of the kids had contacted their parents, and since Buck is a minor and they crossed state lines, Alfonso deduces that the FBI might also be involved. Betty panics, wondering if crossing into another dimension means she'll die in this one, questioning if the kids wanted her to cross over because they are young and shouldn't die yet. With things as they are, the group decides to smash their phones to avoid tracking. Betty decides they should take a bus to her uncle's house to lay low. Suddenly, a car speeds up and crashes with a bang, startling them. Jesse has a flashback to the shooting incident, and though the others quickly realize it was a false alarm, Jesse appears particularly shaken. On the bus, Steve sits next to him, urging him to get some rest. Betty's cousin welcomed them to her seaside home. The kids, having grown up inland, had never seen the ocean before. She had set up tents for them on the beach, and they excitedly rushed over. However, Jesse stayed back, watching from a distance. Betty said her goodbyes to her now unconscious uncle, thanking him for brightening her and her twin brothers' lives. When the cousin asked why she had brought the children, Betty reminisced about how the few weeks they spent there each year were a rare escape from the chaos at home. The cousin revealed that she had received a call from the local sheriff the previous day, informing her about the Amber Alert. She had told the sheriff that Betty might have been confused after the shooting incident, mistakenly thinking she was protecting the kids by taking them away. While she should have notified the sheriff upon their arrival, she wanted to give Betty a chance to explain. Betty simply said they would leave by morning, leaving the cousins stunned. When she pressed if Betty had joined a cult, Betty reluctantly explained that she had been struggling to cope with her brother's death, and it was OA who had helped her. The cousin asked if OA was the girl who had died, and Betty insisted OA wasn't really dead. The cousin, exasperated, agreed to let them rest for the night and promised to think it over. Steve asked the hot-tempered girl if she really believed Betty could manage this. The girl reminded him that Betty had rushed into the cafeteria for their sake. Meanwhile, Betty was looking at a photo of her twin brother on the wall and overheard Jesse talking to her uncle. Jesse recalled the joy of family vacations before his dad left and how he felt warm and safe, wrapped in a blanket in the back seat, half asleep. He mused that heaven must feel like that. Betty was touched, saying his words were heartwarming, making Jesse realize he wasn't alone. He discreetly took something as he stood up. Betty thanked him for comforting her uncle and told him to prepare everyone to wake before sunrise. She wanted to see a beautiful view before leaving this dimension and to finish the ritual before her cousin could call the police. Jesse walked to the beach, silently watching the sunset before heading back to the tent, glancing at what he had taken. Betty had the dream again. She was looking at a photo of herself with her brother, hearing a voice saying they needed help. She called out to her brother, but then heard another voice asking her to pull them back. It was Jesse, lying in front of her, asking her to save him. She woke up in a panic and rushed to the beach, only to find Jesse dead from an overdose, with pain relief patches he had taken from Betty's uncle. Unable to withstand the loss of their friend, Buck suggested they use the ritual to bring Jesse back. The cousin, noticing their odd behavior after waking up, walked over and found Jesse on the ground, promptly calling the sheriff. Despite their efforts, it seemed the ritual hadn't worked. Steve was in denial, and Alfonso urged him to leave before the police arrived. They drove off in the cousin's car, all deeply affected and silent. As they saw the police and ambulance, Alfonso panicked and pulled over. Steve suddenly jumped out and started running after the ambulance, ignoring the hot-tempered girl's calls. From a distance, he watched as Jesse's body was taken away and began performing the strange ritual. The others, unsure of what to do, decided to rest at a nearby motel. Alfonso secretly called a number on a business card with the FBI emblem on the back. Steve danced until sunset, then, exhausted, wandered into an unused vacation house where he shaved his head. In the hotel, the hot-tempered girl felt guilty. They had always known that Jesse was feeling very down and needed help, but they chose to ignore him. The girl suggested they check out the clinic on Treasure Island that Jesse had found. However, Betty couldn't continue. She felt her mind had been unclear lately, which had allowed all this to happen. She decided to turn herself in to the police and take full responsibility. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Everyone was tense. Alfonso took a glance and then opened the door. It was the counselor Alfonso had called. Alfonso explained how they had ended up here step by step. The counselor asked if they needed help. Alfonso wasn't sure if the counselor could be trusted because he had never asked why Alfonso was at OA's family house that day. The counselor then asked what Alfonso meant by house. Alfonso realized it might refer to space. The counselor confirmed, saying it's space. The school, the church, the hotel, and the clinic are all spaces. Betty then recounted seeing some things on the medium's TV that she didn't want to admit. In the room at that time, it wasn't just them. There were others. Even now, she could feel that it wasn't just a few of them here. So, Betty believed different timelines were connected through spaces. The counselor agreed to her theory. Betty finally understood and realized she wasn't losing her mind. The counselor said that she had seen through the surface. Betty picked up Jesse's map and said it looked like they were destined to go to Treasure Island. She asked why the counselor was helping them. The counselor replied that Betty needed help and he was sent to help her. At that moment, the lights outside flickered a few times and then went out. The scene shifts to the greenhouse in the parallel world where investigator Kareem brought the police to search the entire house. But through the hidden passage under the bed, they didn't find the house model. The terrifying empty space behind the door was also gone. OA woke up under a tree in the park, covered in dirt. She found a place to drink some water to clear her head. The moment the water touched her face, she had a sudden vision of nearly falling on a ferry. It was a memory belonging to Nina. She paused, then walked towards Nina's apartment across the way. At the hospital, the seasoned player was complaining that Kareem had brought her out. The doctor came to inform them that both of their blood tests showed severe mercury sulfide poisoning, which had seeped from the steam under the greenhouse. This was causing their hallucinations, and they needed to detoxify, or their lives would be at risk. After the doctor left, the seasoned player explained that the toxic gas had been there for at least a few centuries. High-level players of the mysterious game knew about the sacred spring water of the local tribe and that its steam contained toxins. Karim blamed Pierre for leading people there despite knowing it was toxic. The seasoned player admitted that she knew Pierre was using them, but she still wanted to go back and find the rose window. Karim wanted to stop her, but seeing she couldn't be persuaded, he said he would have the doctor watch her and then left. Oe saw police patrolling outside the apartment, so she took a detour to the back. The doorman spotted her from a distance, called her Nina, and showed the way. He even mentioned that several men had been looking for her, claiming to be her boyfriend. Oe responded she only has one boyfriend named Homer, but he doesn't remember her. Once inside, they found the apartment had been broken into. Everything was in disarray, with Nina's recordings playing, but nothing valuable was missing. It seemed like someone was searching for something specific. Oe thought of Nina's eye pendant and found it was a USB drive. Meanwhile, Dr. Homer took sick leave and didn't go to the clinic. However, Hap tracked him down at home, demanding to know what Scott had told her. Scott had once had a near-death experience where he found himself in a brightly lit place and saw Hap and Oe, though they appeared different, more intimate, like a couple. Hap spoke with a British accent and called Oe something that began with B, but Scott couldn't hear clearly. There were several cameras above them. Then an old woman came over to teach him the third movement. As Hap turned to leave after hearing this, Dr. Homer, alarmed, pressed him for answers. Hap lied, saying Rachel had been transferred to another hospital. He accused Dr. Homer of worsening Rachel's shared psychotic disorder by allowing Nina to interact with them, which led to Rachel's suicide attempt. He claimed he hadn't told her this earlier to avoid alarming her. Dr. Homer, terrified, agreed to meet him in the director's office that night to discuss her condition. Oe went to the boathouse to find Karim, who was furious. He had been searching for Oe all night and couldn't reach her. He claimed that the incident in the greenhouse was just due to poisoning. Oe didn't argue and urgently asked him to check the USB drive, which contained a video left by the experiment supervisor for Nina. The video revealed that the dream research was initially Nina's idea, but the experiment supervisor decided to resign after seeing a particular footage. The footage showed Michelle opening the rose window in the greenhouse's attic, though it wasn't clear what she saw. The image then blurred, and Michelle collapsed. Karim asked where the USB drive came from. Oe explained it belonged to Nina and was in her hand when she arrived. Confused, Karim asked where she came from. Oe revealed that Michelle, whom Karim was searching for, was a young man named Buck, whom she knew. Buck was a transgender person, and Oe came from another dimension, with Buck and others helping her cross over into Nina's body, suppressing Nina's consciousness. This explains why sometimes Nina's memories would flash. However, Karim thought Oe was spewing nonsense to avoid admitting her involvement in Michelle's disappearance, so he threatened to call the police. Angrily, he picked up his phone, warning Oe to leave or he would report her. He vowed to continue the investigation until he found Michelle's body. Oe left speechlessly. Karim hung up and threw his phone aside in frustration. Meanwhile, Hap proposed discharging Scott from the clinic, but asked for his help with an experiment before leaving. Scott was reluctant and proposed that Hap should turn himself in to the police and confess to Rachel's murder. Hap assured Scott that Rachel was fine and that he would see her after his discharge. Seeing Hap's confidence, Scott agreed to the experiment in exchange for releasing Renata. Following Hap's instructions, Scott embarked on the journey into the greenhouse. Karim went to the experiment supervisor place and found signs of forced entry. Crows had already gathered around her corpse. He then visited his partner, who was in labor at home with a midwife present. Karim handed her the videos of the experiment supervisor and Michelle, as well as footage of the experiment supervisor's death, before setting off to find Pierre. Oe arrived at the Syzygy club and asked the club manager to help her remember herself. Aware of her amnesia and hospitalization, he didn't suspect anything and mentioned that Nina loved smoking and drinking, was always the life of the party, and her performances based on her dreams had made the club famous. He also noted her deep passion for relaxation. A voice interrupted, and it was Elodie. She asked if Nina was the woman Hap loved. Oe questioned how Elodie knew Director Hap of this parallel world. Elodie replied that he had tried to institutionalize her. Startled, Oe asked who she was. Elodie asked Oe to consider her a consultant, a guide, or a messenger, and like Oe, a traveler of this dimension. Oe asked if Elodie could retain the memories of the body she inhabited while crossing dimensions. Elodie affirmed, adding that suppressing the host's consciousness was not ideal. She understood Oe wanted to use Nina's knowledge to awaken Homer and escape Hap's control. However, Elodie warned that escaping Hap was impossible, as some connections transcend dimensions. OA and her companions were part of the same cosmic family, destined to cross dimensions together. OA insisted she didn't want to be with Hap. Elodie countered, saying that part of hers does. She explained that events in one dimension affect others, like echoes resonating. When two people meet, their fates intertwine, influencing encounters in other dimensions. Not just Hap, but when Homer met Buck, Michelle began playing the mysterious game, connecting with Nina. OA asked how to break these connections. Elodie cautioned that doing so was dangerous. It could shatter consciousness and prevent her and Homer from ever meeting. She added that OA needed Hap, but OA saw him as a murderer. Elodie explained that Hap was her shadow, and without a shadow, one lacks the will to live. OA asserted her strong will to live was not because of Hap. Elodie said she believed in balance and had given Hap something to provide OA with something. However, OA seemed too stubborn to accept it. She advised OA to free Nina first to release Homer by confronting her deepest fears and traumas. This would allow her to merge with Nina before the point of divergence. Elodie said she had hope for OA before leaving. By this time, Scott had entered a part of the greenhouse and fainted inside. At the apartment, OA recalled Dr. Homer saying she had imprisoned Nina deep within. She remembered her childhood struggles underwater and mustered the courage to lie in a bathtub full of water. Moments later, it seemed she had really returned to a point before boarding the school bus, and Nina's memories began to surface. OA then woke up. Meanwhile, Kareem reached Pierre's place. Pierre wasn't surprised by Kareem's visit, but claimed ignorance about Michelle's fate. When accused of poisoning teenagers, Pierre said his lawyers were handling it, and he wasn't afraid of lawsuits. Kareem mentioned the experiment supervisor's death and Nina's institutionalization, but Pierre showed no interest in arguing. Instead, he invited Kareem to follow him, promising it would be worthwhile. He mused about the true value of moon landings, noting how viewing Earth from space permanently altered human consciousness. Pierre led Kareem to a room where Michelle was lying, and to Kareem's shock, Mrs. Vu was sitting nearby. Scott was submerged on the lab table in the clinic. Hap watched in amazement as a bud from Scott's ear blossomed into a flower. Hap extracted a glowing part and swallowed it. His eyes darted rapidly, as if seeing something. He could hear faint, chaotic sounds. Someone was shouting to call an ambulance. A voice sounding like Hap's asked Prairie if she could hear him, mixed with the sound of sirens. Another voice seemed to ask someone named Britt if they could hear. Hap then opened his eyes. Kareem accused Mrs. Vu of leading him into a trap, but she insisted that the person wasn't her daughter, Michelle. Michelle was still trapped in the greenhouse. Kareem thought Mrs. Vu was in denial and prepared to leave. Pierre stopped him, revealing that the experiment supervisor had only mentioned the first 3 items. The fourth one was actually a man's face. Pierre had hired top police sketch artists from around the world, producing dozens of sketches, all unmistakably Kareem's face. This indicated the greenhouse was calling him. Pierre, though unsure of the reason, believed it would be a revelation akin to viewing Earth from the moon. At the clinic, OA walked in casually, speaking in a thick Russian accent, and told Director Hap that Nina wants to see him. Hap received the message that Nina specifically wanted to see him. He studied her closely through the surveillance, noting that her demeanor was nothing like the Prairie he knew. Dr. Homer thought he misheard and suggested it might be Nina's multiple personalities. Hap instructed Dr. Homer to bring her up, suspecting it might be a ploy for discharge. As OA pushed the door open, Betty from the original world simultaneously sensed something. It turned out that she and 3 others were about to enter the abandoned Treasure Island clinic. OA hesitated briefly before entering. Meanwhile, at the boathouse, Kareem was awakened by the howling wind, haunted by thoughts of Michelle still being in the house and the house calling him. Unable to calm down, he packed something in an envelope marked for his partner and left. Dr. Homer came to fetch OA, who continued speaking in her Russian accent. She said he was right. She had locked Nina inside her, and she should have listened to him and let Nina out. She told a small joke, making Dr. Homer laugh just as the elevator arrived. Seeing Hap, OA turned to Dr. Homer and said she would take it from here and gave him a kiss. The touch triggered Homer's memories. Unable to react, Dr. Homer instinctively followed. Scenes of his hand pressed against the glass door, the moments separated by glass, flashed before him. Suddenly, the power went out, trapping him in the elevator. As he panicked, memories of the sheriff couple's murder surfaced. Homer's consciousness fully awakened, and he pounded on the door, shouting for OA. On the other side, the group from the original world arrived at the room with the fish tank, marveling at how accurate Jesse's investigation was. Suddenly, a voice from behind startled them, saying they should have listened to him. It was Steve, who had also made his way there alone. Betty suddenly realized something. Steve said he needs help, and it dawned on Betty that the figure in her dream wasn't her twin brother, but Steve. Then, Betty sensed that OA was also in the clinic, though not in this room. Facing the confident Nina, Hap felt completely unsettled and uneasy. Nina asked if he remembered how they met. Hap guessed it was through Pierre. Nina corrected him, saying it's her who introduced them to each other. After she read his book on quantum psychiatry, she came to visit him, and the Matryoshka doll was her gift to him. It turns out, Nina had initially hired Director Hap because she recognized his research could help decode the mysteries of the Green House. However, while Nina was dealing with her father's death, Hap had betrayed her. Hap insisted he could never betray her. But Nina countered, saying Pierre created the mysterious game, but it was Hap who planted the idea during his therapy, manipulating Pierre to create the game and exploit teenagers. The rose window reveals the truth, but not everyone can handle it. Hap argued it wasn't that simple. Nina challenged him, asking him to show her what he had done with her money. Meanwhile, Kareem had returned to the greenhouse, piecing the floor tiles back together as he moved forward. In the clinic, Renata heard Homer's shouts and found him. Homer urgently asked Renata to release him, explaining that Hap had taken OA. Renata asked if he was Homer or Dr. Homer from the parallel world. Homer replied he's both. Renata then began breaking the door down. Hap led Nina to a mysterious room in the lab, which contained a pool with many flowers floating on the surface. He explained, everyone has a multi-dimensional map within them, a garden of forking paths waiting for them to nurture. Meanwhile, Kareem reached the room full of mirrors and approached the door he hadn't checked last time. Inside was an empty room, but engraved on the door were the words, saying they shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all their exploring will be to arrive where they started and know the place for the first time. Betty led the group into the room where OA was located and remarked that they are here too. Hap explained that the flowers could reveal images from different dimensions, which he used to create a rough map. Based on these images, one could imagine and accurately reach the scene dimensions. OA looked beneath the flowers and saw submerged bodies, recognizing Scott and exclaiming his name, which inadvertently revealed her identity. Hap, relieved to see it was Prairie rather than Nina, suggested she eat a petal to experience the visions. Ignoring him, OA continued to look, discovering Alfonso, Jesse, and Steve. While Hap excitedly detailed his findings and tried to recruit her, OA paid no attention. Instead, she reflected on how similar she and Hap were. She admitted she had once envied Nina for seemingly having the world, unconsciously suppressing her, just as Hap envied Homer, Rachel, and the others. But now, Nina had shown her another way of life, making her realize that her hardships were the path to becoming an angel. Despite Hap's betrayal, she had survived and gained something he never could. Rising, OA continued in Russian, saying Hap had violence, fear, and loneliness while she had strength. The lights flickered, power returned, and thunder roared. Switching to English, she declared they have faith. Sensing the situation turning against him, Hap quickly fled for his shitty life. Kareem, following the clues from the door, returned to the well, opened the iron gate that had blocked his way, and swam towards a red glow. He discovered a ladder leading upwards. Betty sensed the group on the other side had fallen asleep and that OA had left the room, so she followed her outside. She sensed she was surrounded by something dangerous. OA had been led to a strange device. Hap expressed his weariness of fighting her and proposed taking her to a dimension he glimpsed from Scott's flower, where she didn't hate him, they were close, and everyone called her OA except herself. OA retorted that she would never forget who she was. As Hap activated the device, Betty sensed it and signaled everyone to start performing the collective ritual. At that moment, Kareem reached the attic where the rose window was. OA warned Hap if he opened the portal, she would bring them back to the dead original world. But Hap dismissed her threat, swallowed a petal, and saw the visions again. Suddenly, Homer rushed in and tackled Hap. As Homer called out, OA was shot by Hap but continued, saying she remembered now. Seeing the portal open, she told Homer they must cross. It will take her somewhere she doesn't know herself. Homer must find her and she will follow him. After saying this, Homer closed his eyes. OA stood, waiting for the ritual to end, as Hap's gaze slowly shifted upwards. Meanwhile, Kareem opened the rose window, revealing a dazzling light. He saw OA suspended in the air. OA also saw him but continued to ascend. Steve stood confidently, but a pigeon flying out of the attic startled OA, causing her to fall. Steve collapsed simultaneously. Kareem watched as OA crashed to the ground. Hap, regaining consciousness with ringing ears, hurried to check on OA, calling her Prairie and saying they had crossed over. But the person before him had short hair, and the staff called her Brit. It turns out they were sent into a third dimension instead of returning to their original world. Kareem, looking out the window, realized he was on a film set, complete with his houseboat and the envelope he had left for his partner. There was even a model of the greenhouse. He saw Michelle on the set and shouted for her. She heard him and, despite the set being just scenery, climbed up. As she touched the window, Michelle in the parallel world woke up and embraced her mother, crying like a giant baby. The rose window in front of Kareem also returned to the real street view. Hap convinces the paramedics not to stop him from boarding the ambulance, claiming that the woman is his wife. As the ambulance sped to the hospital, a familiar figure chased after it, catching up and jumping in. It was Steve who sat down and held OA's hand, then calmly greeted Hap behind her, suggesting that the group's rescue journey has more to come. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.